Yes, it's Uncle Jegs, and today's video will be covering the third and last transport mechanism in cells. That's active transport, yeah? We have these sections in this video. What is active transport? Active transport in plants, specifically in the roots. Active transport in animals, specifically in the small intestine. As always, check out the description for today's worksheet and also the answers to the previous video's worksheet. Alright, let's do this thing. Let's recap diffusion and osmosis. Diffusion is the net movement of particles from a high concentration to a low concentration. Osmosis is the diffusion of water from a dilute solution to a more concentrated solution through a semi-permeable membrane. If you haven't seen those two videos yet, click the card because you'll be baffling yourself if you jump straight into active transport. Now, remember that osmosis is the diffusion of water, so the water particles are still moving from a high concentration to a low concentration. It's just that the larger solute particles are not free to move around. Here is a question that links these two ideas together. Describe the similarities between diffusion and osmosis. The best way to understand the two marks that you need here is to think of this in terms of a graph showing the concentration gradient. In the diffusion box, I have 6 particles here and 0 here. Drawing this on a graph, you see that the diffusion mechanism moves down the concentration gradient. It moves from a high concentration to a low concentration. It's just like letting go of a ball that's on a hill. It moves down by itself. You don't provide any energy to do so. The same is true in osmosis, but it requires a little bit more attention to detail. Here we are concerned with the movement of water. I have 6 water particles here and 0 here, but also I have more solute particles here than over here. The water will still diffuse from a high to a low concentration of water, but remember, we have to say that it's moving from a dilute solution to a concentrated solution. We can see from the graph what our first similarity is. Both diffusion and osmosis move down the concentration gradient. That's your first mark, yeah? The next mark has to do with energy. Remember when I held the ball at the top of the hill? I didn't add energy to it. I didn't push the ball. It went down by itself. The same thing with our particles here. They roll down the concentration gradient without us having to add any additional energy to it. So your 2 marks come from stating that both osmosis and diffusion move down the concentration gradient. That's 1 mark. And the second mark is that they do so without additional energy. Some of you out there that are part of the geek gang, you've probably already guessed 2 things that active transport must already have. But let's take this one step at a time, yeah? Let's say that you want to move all these particles from here to here. Diffusion would just lead to an even mix of particles, so we have even particles on both sides, a number of particles. But I said I want to move all of them over here. Well, the first thing I need to do here is add a semi-permeable membrane, our good old friend, the semi-permeable membrane. Before, this just locked our particles, except the water, in the location that they started off in. In the last video, I told you that the cell membrane is more complex than just having tiny holes inside it. Here, we are going to reveal just a tiny little bit of that complexity. Let me just, this big book. This is one of the books I had to read when I was in university. Good times, good stuff. Consulting this, you see this diagram. This shows us what an actual cell membrane looks like. You see that within these lipid molecules, you have these protein molecules floating around like icebergs. This is called the fluid mosaic model, but let's not worry about that at all. A more detailed representation of one of these proteins is here. We can see that the protein is allowing the hydrogen ions to move from one side of the membrane to the other side. It's essentially a pump, a protein pump. Now imagine that I want to absorb these particles here. They couldn't move around because of the membrane, but when you get the protein pump in the cell membrane, they are able to move from one side of the cell membrane to the other side. In this case, that's from the outside to the inside. And just like our enzymes have a complementary shape that allows them to attach themselves to a specific substrate and bind into that active site, these protein pumps have a specific shape that only allows certain particles to pass through them. As time goes on, you see that we are moving particles from a low concentration to a high concentration. Drawing on our graph now, you see that we are going up the concentration gradient. We are rolling our particles up the concentration gradient hill. And to do so, this requires energy. And that energy is coming from your mitochondria. They take in oxygen and glucose and release carbon dioxide, water, and of course, that chemical energy that we need. This process is called aerobic respiration, and you need to memorize that formula. I haven't balanced the equation here, but we'll be looking at it specifically in a future video. Here are some summary notes. Active transport moves substances from a low concentration to a high concentration using energy. The energy from active transport comes from the aerobic respiration of glucose and oxygen in the mitochondria. Cells that use active transport have a lot of mitochondria inside them to provide the energy needed. The most likely situation that you will find active transport in your GCSEs will be in the roots of plants. Key things. This happens specifically in the root hair cells, yeah? Here, they take up not only water but mineral ions. You can call mineral ions nutrients, but please, I beg you, don't call them vitamins. Vitamins are made by living organisms, so they tend to be pretty complex in their structure. This here is vitamin C, while mineral ions are usually small ions. An important mineral for plants is magnesium. Okay, allow me to geek out a little bit, yeah? In our blood, we have red blood cells, and these have hemoglobin inside them. This is what transports the oxygen around your body. The central part of hemoglobin looks like this. Notice the iron in the middle here, yeah? It's the same iron that's on Mars, which gives it that blood-like red color. Mars, after all, was the Greek god of war. Anyways, back onto green Earth. It is green because of the chlorophyll inside chloroplast. And look what the central part of chloroplast looks like. This is just another example of how interconnected the whole of nature is. So plants need magnesium to make chlorophyll and so to photosynthesize. It is important that we are able to use active transport in roots so that they can get all the minerals that they need, especially magnesium. If you're going to be asked about active transport in animals, it will likely be in your small intestine. When you eat your food, it technically hasn't gone inside your body yet. That's because the GI tract that runs from your mouth to the other side is simply just a long tube. It is only an illusion of folding that makes us think that the food has entered our bodies when we eat. Think of it this way. If I was to get your body and straighten out your GI tract and ignore the sphincters, I will be able to look down from your mouth and see straight onto the floor below you. Your food isn't absorbed in your stomach either, but in your small intestines. Remember these projections called villi? They line your small intestine and have a high surface area for absorption. Active transport is needed to get as much of these nutrients from your food into your body as possible. We don't want to be like rabbits. They eat their poo to get some of the nutrients that they missed the first time round. Imagine if that was our reality. Toilets would be like mini restaurants. Before I go, I want to leave you with some extra reading on how your large intestine actually is able to work against the concentration gradient to absorb water. This isn't part of the specification, but I think it's pretty interesting.
I told you about these dead jokes.
You're killing my vibe. So yeah, that was active transport. The way the GCSEs are going, they want you to be able to apply what you learn to a completely different situation. They could ask you a question about a random animal, let's say a crocodile for instance. Some of these crocodiles live in very, very salty water, but they have protein pumps in their tongue to get rid of that excess salt. You just have to apply what you know about active transport to an unfamiliar situation. But yeah, that's all I've got time for today. Like if you like, subscribe if you found me helpful, and yeah, in a bit.